Welcome to day 4, everyone. Today we're going to look at some statistics and some of the history of women and LGBTQ folks in media. This is our final day of the week, and this is the final day we're looking at these kind of general questions. Starting next week, we're going to be looking at specific pieces of media, so this marks a real turning point in the course. And as always, today we have our reading responses and our virtual presence, which is mostly made up of replies to the reading responses. So our first piece is an hour-long documentary from the Makers series about women in Hollywood. This looks at some of the history of the trailblazing women who have been involved in creating films, creating TV shows, starring in films and TV shows, and looking at some of the barriers that they faced. One thing to think about here is a lot of the assumptions that were made at the time and are still made about how women could possibly participate. There's also a lot to think about in terms of changes, what has evolved, how are women more present in Hollywood now than they were, in the 50s, for example, the early days, and then also how some continuities exist, how some of the barriers have continued and how we're still seeing a much smaller number of women compared to men, both behind and in front of the camera. And then think some about how important these trailblazers are in terms of creating space for other people. This Makers series is great for history of women's involvement in a whole series of fields, and you'll see on this page there's links to more in the series if you're interested. Our second set of readings is a number of statistics. I don't expect you to go through every single possible thing in all of these readings, but just to give you a broad overview. The first one is from the New York Film Academy. This looks at both the presence of women in front of and behind the camera, the way that women have been recognized or not recognized by the industry and the Oscars, and so forth, and just looking at really how male-dominated the film industry is, and you can see it at all kinds of levels from this graphic. We then have a Tumblr blog about the Headless Women of Hollywood, and this just looks at these omnipresent, incredibly common posters that show women's bodies without their heads. The heads are irrelevant. Often the women on the posters are not actually part of the movie at all. They're just added to the poster to, have a woman to look at for the male gaze, and this is obviously very much connected to the male gaze. And I think what's notable here is that all of these posters are selling the movie on the grounds of the male gaze. What these posters promise the assumed male viewer is, if you come to our movie, you will be able to gaze at women, you will be presented women without having to care about who they are or what their wants are or what their emotions are. All you'll have to care about is their bodies, and that's kind of the implicit promise that's made by the presence of these headless women on the posters. As I say, obviously there's hundreds of posts here, you don't have to go through the whole thing, but you will see some interesting discussion of some of the variants on this, some of the ways that when headless men do occasionally show up, how they're presented somewhat differently. One in particular you might want to look for is the Deadpool poster. There was some discussion about that, so that's an interesting one. And then the third site we have here is Polygraph. They have all kinds of statistics here. They do interesting analysis. Their site's really tricky to navigate because the stats kind of pop up over the text. And if you look at the top of the page, you'll see there's 3 kind of tabs you can click on. If you click on those, it'll make it a lot easier to look at the statistics. What they did in this particular piece is analysis of scripts, so which lines were spoken by men, which lines were spoken by women, how much men dominated the dialogue in movies. One thing that stood out to me is that even princess movies, we think of Pocahontas and Mulan or whatever we think of as movies that are very much for especially young girls, that are very much starring women, still are male dominated in terms of the scripts, even in their own movies. These young female role models take a second role, and that connects very much to our next topic. And then if you want to hear more about the Bechdel test, they also on Polygraph did some statistical analysis of that in movies, so you can see the link on the page and follow it to that if you're interested. Our final piece today is a powerful and influential movie from the mid-90s called The Celluloid Closet. This looks at the history of representations of especially gay men and lesbian women in Hollywood. It's based on a book from 1981 by the activist Vito Rosso, and that book was very influential and was a big part of what kicked into gear what is now called the New Queer Cinema, which we're going to look at later in the course. But this is an important piece in terms of the creation of that. The context for that book and this film is the effects of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The author, Vito Rosso, died of complications from AIDS. And this was, an incredibly impactful disease on especially the gay community in the US during the 1980s. And they faced just shocking government neglect. The Reagan administration refused to address it. When they did, they dismissed it. There's even a recording of the press secretary laughing about the disease. There was a lot of public speaking by people like Pat Buchanan, Jerry Falwell, leaders of the right-wing Christian movement, saying that this disease was deserved, that it was kind of a just punishment from God for the lifestyle, as they described it, that people were leaving. And one of the things that we see here is the incredible cost of invisibility, the fact that gay people were not part of the public consciousness, were not thought of as being mainstream and important Americans, was a big part of the reason that over 20,000 people died before the president even addressed and admitted that the crisis was going on. It's hard to imagine now the impact of that, but imagine a disease tearing through America, killing over 20,000 people in just a few short years, and the president just ignoring it, refusing to mention it. Was really damaging for that community and made that community realize how much their exclusion from public life, their invisibility from media, from our awareness mattered in terms of what they would see in terms of the response from the government and the valuing of their lives by the nation. If you want to learn more about this, and it's a very important event, we're talking just 30 years ago, there's a couple of great documentaries on Netflix. One is We Were Here, that's a more personal look at it. The second one is How to Survive a Plague, which looks at it more from an activist point of view. I definitely recommend both of those, especially We Were Here, which is a very powerful documentary. And overall, one of the things to think about with the Celluloid Closet is how we have this hidden history, how people who existed, certainly, since the beginning of Hollywood, were still working behind the scenes, were making movies, in some cases were huge movie stars, people like Rock Hudson, and yet their existence was secretive, was hidden. We talk about Gore Vidal here, who made Ben-Hur, was the writer of Ben-Hur, which was this massive blockbuster Hollywood success, Oscar-winning film, and yet the gay text or subtext had to be kept secret, not spoken about, because these people were essentially in hiding because of the hostility they faced. So I think this is a great movie. There's a lot of very enjoyable moments. I hope you enjoy it.